I spoke to a former US national security advisor, that's the top dog on national security in America, back in the day. And there were a couple of points he made which are sort of obvious when you hear them, but I have to say they weren't front of my mind, because obviously we've been focused on all the humanitarian issues in Gaza. He made 2 points. One is the Americans are very focused on the hostages. And I remember from my time in politics and in government, hostage situations can completely dominate, number 10 or the White House. And they're incredibly emotive, very difficult for the Prime Minister or the President involved.
And what was particularly difficult about that when you were in Downing Street?
I think people don't realise how much the fate of individual hostages really weighs on the mind of a British Prime Minister. I mean, I know that David Cameron would, really agonise about how to handle hostage situations, whether to send in the SAS, which was always a prime ministerial decision, and risk the hostage being killed. It's tragically happened in one hostage rescue with us in West Africa. And I'd tell you something interesting that David insisted on doing, although many of his senior advisors thought he shouldn't. He thought he should watch the videos that were recorded of these hostages that ISIS had taken, British hostages, before they were executed. And they would often make a direct appeal. They'd often say, they'd address their kind of final video message to David Cameron. And David felt he should watch them, even though, of course, it was pure kind of propaganda and almost sort of designed to get under his skin and into his head and mess with it. But David was a very level-headed individual. He thought he owed it to these hostages who were about to be killed to listen to what they had to say. So these, in Israel, that's not just one hostage or half a dozen hostages. It's 200 hostages, many, many families who've organised themselves, and there's enormous pressure on the Israeli government to do something about it. And of course, the release this week of a very small number, 4 hostages, has, I think, complicated the situation, because it suggests that you could get more out if Israel held off from its invasion, which is no doubt exactly what Hamas are trying to get people to think. And then second, the need to reinforce US bases and embassies across the region is one of the reasons why Biden is playing for time with the Israelis, trying to forestall the big ground invasion and rushing out air defense systems, which Biden himself had withdrawn. I didn't actually appreciate this until I looked into it a couple of years ago. But they're expecting a big anti-US reaction across the Middle East once the ground fighting really gets underway. And it just reminds you that these governments, these prime ministers and presidents, are having to weigh a whole set of issues which aren't just about your attitude towards Israel or the humanitarian crisis in Gaza. You're also looking at, what do you do about your own citizens? Some of them may be hostages. What are you doing about your own soldiers or embassies around the world? And any one of those issues can completely dominate an administration trying to do other things as well at the same time.
Well, of course, look, as you say, American military power being built up in potential anticipation of conflict widening, the moment Iran becomes more drawn into this, if that's what happens, and that's when the economics gets very dangerous. But then, of course, it's also the case that Joe Biden's a politician, and he's got to get elected in America, and he has to balance his own party and political support. It wasn't more than a few days ago that America was standing out against the UN French calls for some kind of humanitarian ceasefire pause. And then this week we saw a shift, and Secretary of State Blinken now saying that we do need to have space for there to be humanitarian support and for people to be able to leave Gaza. That is a shift in the American position. That felt to me probably driven by American politics.